Soldier Mage King, Chapter 13, The Curse of Cornelius Sigan, Part 1. Merlin had made a few friends since arriving in Camelot. Chief among them was Gwen, of course, but one person she'd helped the most was Arthur's put-upon squire, Galahad, who often did a lot of the work that would be done by a manservant. Arthur couldn't seem to keep one around. So it fell to Galahad to run around with Arthur's armor, work on his horses. She often helped him with Arthur's armor and various other chores, since he was supposed to also have time to actually train with the knights. But that rarely actually happened when Arthur treated him like little more than a servant. So when they rode out to go hunt a boar that had been seen in the woods outside the city, and Arthur brought along a man named Cedric, who he claimed had properly done up the girth on his saddle, Merlin frowned. "You all right?" she asked, slipping up to Galahad. He frowned. "I know I did that girth up right. It couldn't have slipped loose on its own," he insisted, and Merlin nodded. "I believe you," she said, and Galahad smiled. "You seem to be the only one these days," he said, a frown slipping back into place as they continued through the trees. Technically, Merlin shouldn't have been there. Servants didn't really go on hunts unless they were long ones, and they were generally there to set up camp for the nights. But because she was also the physician's apprentice, and there was a long-standing track record of people being injured on hunts, either by beasts, stray arrows, or bandits, Leon and Arthur had agreed that Merlin's presence was a good idea. She griped, but it was mostly for show. If she was on the hunts, she could save Arthur when he did something monumentally stupid, like attempting to face down a boar practically the size of a horse alone. Merlin saved him. The new man, Cedric, had dropped his boar spear, and with a whispered word, Merlin threw it without ever touching it, sinking the spear into a soft spot on the boar's neck. She had been at the back of the group, and no one had seen her. But Cedric was quick to jump onto claiming credit for the act. Galahad groaned when Arthur gave him a job as his new manservant. Merlin's job in the morning was to bring Arthur's breakfast, but Cedric was already there, with half a feast. Merlin frowned. Arthur seemed to enjoy this new manservant, but something about him made her skin crawl. "I regret there is one thing I haven't attended to this morning, sire. I haven't had a chance to muck out your stables, my lord," Cedric said with a sly smirk at Merlin. Arthur nodded. "Not bad. Merlin, take that plate back to the kitchens, eat what you want. Get Galahad to muck out my stables, and see if Gaius has anything for you to do today," Arthur ordered. "What about your laundry?" she asked with a frown. "Already done. I thought the physician's apprentice might appreciate a day to focus on her studies," Cedric said, his voice dripping with something that sounded halfway between smugness and insincerity. Merlin frowned, but nodded to Arthur and headed back out of his room. She caught Galahad on the way back down to the kitchens, and they shared Arthur's breakfast. "I don't know, something's just off about him," Galahad said, lamenting to Merlin about the new servant was perhaps a bit unusual for him, given his lightened workload, but she couldn't help but agree. "Yeah, I think so too. He's slimy," she said, and Galahad nodded. "He's also left you the worst job," she said, pulling a face. Galahad nodded glumly before thanking her for sharing and heading off to the stables. Gaius had Merlin running around all morning making his deliveries so he could work on his cures and potions. But on her way back to their quarters, Merlin spotted Galahad mopping at his face in the shadow of the stables. He was still young, a boy of 14, where Arthur was 20 and Merlin 19. He didn't cry openly. It wasn't something the knights did, but Merlin spotted fat tears on his cheeks and switched her steps to walk to him. "You all right?" she asked, and Galahad jumped, looking up at her guiltily, then down at the ground. "No. Arthur thinks I'm not good enough to be his squire," Galahad admitted tearfully, and Merlin knelt down so they were face to face. "What are you talking about? You're one of the only other people Arthur can put up with," she pointed out, frowning at the dung that clung to Galahad's face. I don't know how it happened, Merlin. One moment I was mucking out the stables, and the next I was on the floor. Arthur was yelling at me, and the horses were gone," Galahad admitted. Cedric said something about him needing a more competent squire, and Arthur agreed with him. Merlin frowned and placed a hand on the clean side of Galahad's face. You're not running a fever. You say you were awake one moment, and then the next you were on the ground, she asked, and he nodded. That's not sleep, not even from exhaustion. Do you remember anything at all? She asked, and he shook his head. No. Well, there was an odd smell, but it's hard to really smell anything in the stable, Galahad admitted, and Merlin stood walking around to the door of the stable. She pushed her way inside, ignoring the stable hand's surprise. She frowned around and spotted a small patch of slightly charred straw. Stepping over to it, she kicked it aside and picked up a burned bag. There wasn't much of it left, but from the smell of it, she knew what it was used for. Stomping back outside, she paused by Galahad. Go home. Bathe. I'll see you have tomorrow off. I need to have a few words with Arthur, she said before storming up to the castle. Galahad watched her go, halfway terrified. Galahad didn't fall asleep, he was drugged, Merlin said, and Arthur looked up from his dinner. As ways of announcing herself into his rooms, it was one of Merlin's more creative statements. She stalked over to his table and slapped down the remains of a burned bag of herbs. The smell of the herbs, though mostly ash, made Arthur a little drowsy. So you think we have a horse thief? He asked, examining the remains from afar. I don't give a damn. You do not get to call Galahad incompetent for being drugged. You owe him an apology, Merlin said, and Arthur blinked at her. And people say you're too serious, Arthur said with a slight laugh. Her frown didn't waver. He's 14, Arthur, and you pile responsibilities of a servant and a squire on him, despite him being of noble blood, which honestly I normally don't give a toss about. But Arthur, you're working the poor boy to death, and then you don't care when he could have been seriously injured, Merlin snapped. She hated thinking that Galahad might have been wounded in the horse's escape, but it seemed to be a possibility Arthur hadn't thought of. Perhaps an older squire would be more suitable. I could have a list compiled, sir, Cedric suggested. Merlin whirled on him. You don't get a part in this conversation, Cedric. Don't think I don't see what you're doing, bootlicker. Merlin spat the words at him. Cedric stiffened. Oi, Merlin. You don't get to verbally abuse the other staff, Arthur reprimanded. He's been trying to discredit Galahad for the past 2 days, and if you weren't such a clotpole, you'd see that. She shouted at him. Whirling on her heel, she stormed to the door. Maybe you don't deserve Galahad, she said before slamming the door behind her. Arthur was left blinking, frowning after her. Perhaps she was right. He did ask a lot of Galahad, and normally the boy bore it without a single complaint. Perhaps he had been too harsh. Sire? Cedric asked, and Arthur shook his head. I'm going to bed, he announced, and Cedric scrambled over himself to help Arthur get ready. Arthur never heard him remove the key from his nightstand as he closed his eyes, willing sleep to come.